For years, the logging camp had stood as a lonely outpost deep in the Siberian wilderness. The men stationed there were used to harsh blizzards, avalanches, and the occasional hungry bear wandering too close to their supply sheds. But nothing in their experience had prepared them for what happened on that night. The storm had been raging for hours, a blinding wall of snow and ice that turned the forest into a howling void. Inside the camp's main cabin, 3 loggers, veterans of countless brutal winters, sat in uneasy silence, their rifles propped against the wall. When the alarm bell outside clanged violently in the wind, they thought it was another tree collapsing under the weight of snow. But then came a sound, deep, guttural, and haunting. A wolf's howl. Normally, that sound would trigger one reaction: fear. Siberian wolves were legendary hunters, larger and more ruthless than any found in North America. An adult male could weigh up to 150 pounds and bring down prey much larger than itself. For a wolf to approach humans was not only unusual, it was unheard of. Grabbing their rifles, the men stormed outside, squinting into the blizzard. And then they saw it. A massive, gray-furred wolf staggering through the snowdrifts, its body trembling with exhaustion. The men raised their weapons instinctively, but what the animal did next made them freeze. The wolf collapsed into the snow just feet away, lowering its head in a gesture no one had ever seen before. It wasn't snarling, wasn't baring its teeth. Instead, it pressed its muzzle into the ice and let out a low, broken whine that sounded almost human. One of the loggers, Ivan, muttered under his breath, "This isn't right. Wolves don't do this." But before anyone could respond, the storm cleared just enough for them to see the animal's eyes. They weren't the wild, feral eyes of a predator. They were pleading, desperate, filled with a kind of intelligence that made the men shiver. As the men inched closer, they noticed something even stranger. The wolf's thick fur was crusted with blood and ice, and along its flank were long gashes, as if it had battled something far more dangerous than itself. And despite its wounds, it wasn't attacking. Instead, it would rise shakily, take a few steps toward the tree line, then collapse again, each time glancing back at the men as if urging them to follow. For a long moment, the loggers argued. Protocol, instinct, and common sense screamed at them to stay inside and keep their distance. Wolves were killers, but deep down, each of them felt the same unsettling truth. This animal wasn't here to hunt. It was here to ask for help. What they didn't know yet was that by following it, they would uncover a secret hidden beneath the frozen earth, one that would test the limits of their courage and redefine the line between man and beast forever. The 3 men stood in the swirling snow, hearts pounding, torn between instinct and something deeper. They had all hunted wolves before. They knew the risks. Yet this was no ordinary encounter. The animal's behavior shattered everything they thought they understood about predators. Ivan, the eldest, lowered his rifle first. "Look at him," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "If he wanted us dead, we'd already be bleeding in the snow." His companions exchanged uneasy glances, but none could deny what they were witnessing. The wolf wasn't just injured, it was communicating. The animal rose once more, staggering forward into the tree line, then turning its massive head to lock eyes with the men. That look was impossible to ignore. It wasn't the glare of a predator. It was the gaze of a creature burdened with urgency, as though it was carrying a message. Against every instinct screaming in their bones, the men decided to follow. They strapped on their snowshoes, shouldered their packs, and stepped into the blizzard. The wolf moved slowly, limping heavily, but with a strange determination. Each time it pulled ahead, it paused and glanced back, making sure they were close behind. Hours passed. The storm tore at their clothes, and the icy wind stung their faces. The forest loomed like a wall of shadows, and the men began to wonder if they had lost their minds. Why were they risking their lives for a wounded predator? And yet, every time doubt crept in, the wolf's haunting eyes pulled them forward again. Then came the first sign that this journey was no accident. In a small clearing, barely visible beneath the snow, they found tracks, smaller paw prints trailing alongside the wolf's larger ones. The pattern was unmistakable. Pups! The realization hit them like a thunderclap. The wolf wasn't alone. Somewhere in the wilderness, young wolves were trapped, abandoned, or worse. And this wounded father or mother had braved the impossible to seek human help. Their pace quickened, driven now not just by curiosity, but by an unspoken responsibility. If there were pups out there, didn't have long. In Siberian winters, a single night without shelter or food meant certain death for the young. The wolf led them deeper into the forest, over ridges slick with ice and across half-frozen rivers that groaned beneath their weight. Despite its wounds, it never faltered for long, dragging itself forward with an almost supernatural will. The men's respect for the animal grew with every step. This wasn't just survival, it was sacrifice. As the sun began to sink, turning the snow a dim shade of blue, the wolf suddenly stopped. Its ears twitched, its nose lifted, and it let out a low, mournful whine. The loggers froze, scanning the trees around them. At first, they saw nothing but shifting shadows. And then, they heard it. A faint, pitiful cry drifting on the wind. High-pitched, weak, and unmistakable. The sound of pups. The men's blood ran cold. The cries weren't coming from the ground. They were rising from beneath it. Moving closer, they discovered a sinkhole hidden under the snow, an old collapsed tunnel from a forgotten mining site. The opening was narrow, jagged with ice, leading into a dark, hollow pit. Inside, the muffled cries grew louder. The pups were down there, trapped. The wolf limped to the edge, peered down, and let out a desperate howl that seemed to tear through the night. Then it turned to the men, its eyes burning with an intensity that made them tremble. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't chance. The wolf had led them here for one reason only, to save its young. What the men didn't yet realize was that the tunnel they were about to descend into held more than just helpless pups. Something far more dangerous awaited in the darkness below, something that would turn their rescue mission into a fight for survival. The three men stood on the edge of the sinkhole, staring into the yawning blackness. Snow swirled into the opening, vanishing into a pit so deep they couldn't see the bottom. From below came the whimpering cries of pups, soft, desperate, and fading. Fear clawed at their instincts. This was no place for humans. The Siberian wilderness was unforgiving enough above ground. What horrors might lurk beneath? Yet none of them could ignore the truth. Those pups were alive, and without help, they wouldn't survive the night. The wolf limped closer, muzzle pressed to the icy rim, releasing a mournful whine that echoed down into the shaft. For a long moment, the men and the animal were united in silence. Three humans and a predator bound together by something primal, the instinct to protect the young. Ivan spat into the snow and muttered, "If we walk away now, we'll never forgive ourselves." His companions nodded grimly. The men gathered their gear, ropes, lanterns, a small kit of medical supplies they always carried in case of logging accidents. Their tools were crude compared to military rescue equipment, but they would have to be enough. Ivan hammered an anchor into the frozen earth while Mikhail, the youngest of the group, tied knots with shaking hands. The wolf watched every movement, pacing anxiously, its golden eyes fixed on them with unsettling intensity. It seemed to understand what they were preparing to do. Finally, Ivan looped the rope around his waist. "I'll go first," he said. "If the ground's unstable, better it's me than the boy." Lowering himself slowly, Ivan descended into the darkness, his lantern swinging, throwing long shadows along the icy walls. The air grew colder, sharper with every foot he dropped. The shaft was barely wide enough for his shoulders, forcing him to scrape against jagged rock. When his boots finally touched the bottom, his heart clenched. Two pups lay huddled against the frozen wall, their tiny bodies trembling violently. Their fur was matted with ice, their cries weak and uneven. But they were alive. Ivan crouched, whispering softly, though he knew they couldn't understand him. The pups blinked at the strange figure in the lantern light, too weak to move. He gently scooped them into his arms, wrapping them in a canvas tarp to shield them from the cold. Above, the wolf whined loudly, claws scraping at the edge of the shaft. The moment Ivan held up the bundle, the wolf howled, a raw, aching sound that shook the men to their cores. But then, a new sound rippled through the shaft. A growl. Not from above. From behind. Ivan froze, lantern trembling in his hand. In the far corner of the pit, where shadows clung thickest, a shape stirred. Eyes, red, gleaming, caught the light. And then came the unmistakable sound of claws raking against stone. His blood ran cold. Another predator had found its way into the abandoned tunnel system. Mikhail! Ivan roared up the shaft. Pull me up. Now! The rope jerked as his companions heaved with all their strength. Ivan clutched the pups tightly against his chest as he was yanked upward, his boots scraping the ice. From below, the growl rose into a furious snarl, followed by the thunder of something huge slamming into the wall. Rocks and ice rained down as the shaft trembled. The wolf above exploded into a frenzy, howling and pacing, its hackles raised. It knew the danger, too. Ivan's hands burned as he was dragged up, every second stretching into eternity. At last, his companions seized him by the arms and hauled him out, just as something massive slammed into the shaft wall below, sending a burst of snow and dirt flying upward. The men staggered back, gasping, clutching the pups. For a moment, silence fell. Only the whimper of the rescued cubs and the harsh wind cutting through the trees. "What in God's name was that?" whispered Mikhail, his face pale. No one answered. The wolf pressed close, sniffing frantically at the bundled pups, releasing a sound between a whine and a sob. It nudged Ivan's arm, then nosed the pups gently, as though confirming they were truly alive. Its relief was so raw, so unguarded, that the men could hardly believe they were watching a wild predator. But their relief was short-lived. The growl returned, deeper, angrier, rising up from the shaft. Then came the sound of earth collapsing, stone cracking under tremendous weight. Whatever lurked below was climbing. The men backed away instinctively, but the wolf held its ground, lips curling back, teeth bared. It wasn't running. It was ready to fight. The forest around them went silent, as though the wilderness itself was holding its breath. The men tightened their grips on their rifles. The pups whimpered in Ivan's arms. And then, from the darkness of the shaft, a monstrous shape began to emerge. The men braced themselves as the shaft shuddered violently. Snow and shards of ice cascaded outward, and then, with a roar that seemed to split the night, a massive shadow burst from the darkness. What emerged was not another wolf. It was bigger, much bigger, a bear. But unlike the wounded mother from Ivan's memory of past hunts, this beast was gaunt, its ribs pressing against its matted fur, eyes burning with the madness of starvation. It must have stumbled into the abandoned tunnel system searching for food, and now, driven half-mad by hunger, it had decided to fight its way out. The three loggers stood frozen, rifles half-raised, their breath misting in the icy air. They had faced bears before, but never like this, cornered, enraged, half-starved. To fire meant provoking it. To hesitate meant death. The wolf, however, didn't hesitate. With a guttural snarl, it hurled itself between the men and the bear, its battered body low and tense. This was no ordinary act of instinct. It was a calculated stand, a parent willing to die to protect its young. For a split second, the men hesitated. Here was the very predator they'd been taught to fear, standing as their shield. Then Ivan barked, "Hold your fire unless it charges." The bear advanced, bellowing, its claws tearing gouges into the frozen ground. The wolf snarled in reply, snapping its jaws, darting forward to nip at the giant's legs, then retreating before those claws could crush its skull. It was a desperate, suicidal dance, but it was buying time. The loggers scrambled into action. Mikhail struck a flare, the sudden burst of red light slicing through the blizzard. The bear reared back, momentarily blinded, but its rage only grew. With a roar, it lunged forward, straight toward Ivan, who still cradled the pups against his chest. In that instant, time seemed to slow. The wolf threw itself at the bear's throat. The two predators collided in an explosion of fur and blood, snow spraying like shattered glass. The men staggered back, shouting, rifles raised but unable to fire without hitting the wolf. The struggle was savage, teeth against claws, strength against desperation. The bear's sheer size gave it the advantage. It slammed the wolf to the ground with a swipe that would have shattered bones, but the wolf rolled, sprang, and latched onto its neck, jaws locking with iron will. "Moo!" Ivan shouted, motioning to his companions. They sprinted sideways, circling wide, trying to pull the beast's focus from the pups. The bear roared, staggering under the wolf's weight, its massive body thrashing in fury. And then, with a violent shake, it flung the wolf aside. The animal hit the ground hard, yelping in pain, blood streaking its gray fur. The bear turned back to the humans. Its eyes glowed in the firelight, feral and relentless. It lowered its head, preparing to charge. "Now!" Ivan roared. 3 rifles cracked in unison. The sound thundered through the clearing, echoing off the trees. Bullets slammed into the bear's shoulder and flank. The beast roared in agony, staggering, but it did not fall. If anything, the pain seemed to enrage it further. It charged. The men dove in different directions, snow exploding beneath the bear's massive paws. It barreled straight past Ivan, nearly clipping him, then wheeled with terrifying speed. One swipe caught Mikhail across the shoulder, hurling him into the snow with a scream. Blood stained the whiteness instantly. Panic flared, but then another shape lunged. The wolf, broken and bleeding, forced itself back into the fight. It leapt onto the bear's back, teeth sinking into the ragged flesh at the base of its skull. The bear roared, staggering, trying to shake the smaller predator loose. "Cover me," Ivan bellowed. He shoved the pups into Sergei's arms and swung his axe, the only close weapon he carried. Charging forward, he struck with all the strength of desperation. The blade bit deep into the bear's shoulder. The beast screamed, rearing back, and in that critical moment, Sergei fired a final shot, straight into its chest. The impact knocked the animal backward, crashing into the snow. It thrashed, bellowing, for one agonizing minute, then stilled. The silence that followed was deafening. The men stood gasping, smoke curling from their rifles, hands shaking violently. Blood, human, wolf, and bear stained the snow crimson. For a long moment, no one moved. Then a low sound broke the silence. The wolf. It staggered to its feet, sides heaving, blood dripping from its muzzle. Its eyes met Ivan's, not as predator and prey, but as equals. Then it turned, limping heavily, and nosed the pups, pressing its body against them as though to reassure itself they were still alive. The sight was almost too much to bear. A wild animal, broken and bleeding, refusing to leave its young unguarded. Mikhail groaned from where he lay in the snow, clutching his wounded shoulder. Ivan and Sergei rushed to his side, dragging him back toward the cabin. The wolf followed, the pups stumbling at its side, refusing to let them out of its sight. Back inside, the men worked feverishly to tend both man and beast. They dressed Mikhail's wound, then turned to the wolf. It resisted at first, snarling weakly, but when Ivan knelt with bloodied hands and pressed a rag to its wounds, it stilled. Perhaps it understood. Perhaps desperation had stripped away centuries of instinct. The night passed in uneasy silence. The blizzard howled, the fire crackled, and in the corner of the cabin, the wolf lay curled around its pups, rising only to nudge them closer to the warmth. Every so often, it lifted its head to glance at the men, eyes gleaming with something that could only be described as trust. By morning, the storm had broken. The forest lay quiet beneath a pale sun, as though nothing had happened. But for the men inside that cabin, nothing would ever be the same. The wolf stood shakily, pups at its side. It limped to the door, looked back once, holding their gaze with a silent farewell, and vanished into the trees. The loggers stood in stunned silence. They knew no one would ever believe them. And yet, in their hearts, they knew they had witnessed something few humans ever would. The moment a predator chose trust over fear, sacrifice over survival. But the story wasn't over. Days later, tracks were found circling the cabin, wolf prints, larger and smaller, pressed side by side into the snow. The family had returned, not in hostility, but as if to watch over the men who had once saved them. And so, deep in the Siberian wilderness, an unspoken bond was forged between predator and man, born not of dominance or fear, but of respect. For weeks after the blizzard, the loggers couldn't shake the memory of that night. The echoes of the bear's roar, the sight of the wolf throwing itself into battle, the weight of tiny lives trembling in their arms, all of it replayed in their minds with haunting clarity. They had come to Siberia chasing wages, timber, and the rugged life of survival. But now, every creak of the cabin walls and every gust of wind through the trees reminded them of the pact they had made, not with words, but with blood. At first, they thought the wolf and her pups were gone for good, swallowed by the endless wilderness. But then, on a clear morning, Sergei spotted something through the frosted window. A gray figure, standing at the edge of the tree line. The wolf. She stood tall despite her injuries, her pups tumbling clumsily in the snow at her feet. For a long moment, she didn't move. She only watched. Her golden eyes caught the sunlight, glinting like molten amber. And then, with a slow dip of her head, she turned and vanished into the forest once more. From that day on, the men began to notice her presence more often. Tracks circling the camp, distant howls carried on the night wind, a fleeting shadow at the edge of the firelight. Not threats, never threats. It was as if the wolf was keeping watch, ensuring the men who had risked everything for her family were safe. News of the encounter spread slowly, whispered among trappers and hunters. Most dismissed it as a tall tale, the kind of myth men invent to survive long winters. But those who had seen the scars on Ivan's arms, or the blood-soaked furs piled outside the cabin, knew better. The wolf had trusted them, and in return, they had proven worthy of that trust. Months later, when spring finally thawed the frozen ground, the loggers stumbled across a den not far from the old sinkhole. Inside were bones of animals the wolf had hunted, hares, deer, even the remnants of fish from the river. But among the scattered remains, there was something else, a branch, stripped clean, carefully laid at the entrance. It was no trophy. It was a sign, a token, a message left in the only language a wolf could give. The men understood. It was gratitude. Years passed, and each time they returned to that logging camp, they carried with them the memory of that night. Sometimes, deep in the forest, they would catch sight of gray fur slipping between the trees, or hear the chorus of howls rising beneath the moon. They never fired, never chased. Instead, they listened, letting the sound wash over them like a hymn. Because they knew what few men ever would, that even the wildest corners of the earth, where survival is cruel and life fragile, there exists a bond stronger than fear. A bond born in the silence between two species that should have been enemies, but chose instead to trust. And so, the question remains for you, the listener. If you were standing in that storm, staring into the eyes of a desperate predator begging for help, would you have lowered your weapon? Would you have trusted the impossible? Tell us in the comments below. And if this story moved you, share it. Because sometimes the world needs reminding that courage and compassion can come from the most unexpected places.